Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, I want you to imagine a wild party, that lasts for an entire decade. And then, just like that, overnight, the music stops. That's pretty much the story of America in the 1920s and 30s. Two of the most dramatic and just polar opposite decades in the country's history. So, how did one decade roar while the next one could barely even whisper? That question, right there, is really at the heart of our story. It's this unbelievable pivot, from the dizzying highs of one era to the absolute crushing lows of the next. The 1920s, it was the first decade to actually get its own nickname, the Roaring Twenties. And a huge reason for that roar was this brand new sound that just perfectly captured its energy and spontaneity, and that was jazz. It basically became the soundtrack for every major city. And who was dancing to all that jazz? Well, a whole new generation of women. They were called flappers, and they completely challenged social norms with their short dresses, their bold makeup, and this liberated attitude that was, a world away from the traditional values of the past. And for the first time ever, you had mass advertising and this new idea of buying on credit. It just fueled this national obsession with having the latest and greatest products. All of a sudden, it seemed like everyone had to have a radio to listen to jazz and a car to drive to the speakeasy. But look, all this super-fast change, it didn't happen without a fight. For the first time, more Americans were living in cities than in the countryside, and waves of new immigrants were literally changing the face of the nation. All this tension created what historians now call a cultural civil war. And this comparison, it really just visualizes that central conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got the traditional, all-American girl who, aspired to be a housewife. And on the other, the free-spirited, adventurous flapper who was, as one magazine at the time put it, free to pursue a life as they choose. And this battle between tradition and modernity, it absolutely erupted in a courtroom down in Tennessee. A teacher, a guy named John Scopes, was put on trial for teaching the theory of evolution, and you better believe the entire nation tuned into their radios to hear the arguments. So on one side, you had traditionalists like Mrs. Jessie Sparks, who wrote this very letter to her local paper. For her, this new science was a destructive force, a major threat to her faith, and really, to civilization itself. And then, on the other side, you had modernists like the defense attorney Dudley Field Malone. In this now famous speech from the trial, he argued that, look, this wasn't just about some school teacher, it was about progress and the absolute freedom to think and to learn. But underneath all the prosperity, all the roaring jazz, and all the cultural debates, the economic foundation of the Roaring Twenties was dangerously, dangerously unstable. And that party we talked about, it was about to come to a sudden, crashing halt. October 29th, 1929. That's the date. That's the day it all fell apart. On what became known as Black Tuesday, the stock market, which had been just fueled by risky speculation and people buying stocks on margin, basically with borrowed money, it went into a complete and total freefall. Investors were wiped out, and that triggered this wave of panic that just swept across the entire country. And this wasn't just some brief downturn, not at all. This was the beginning of the Great Depression, a full decade of economic hardship so severe it would completely reshape the country. Just stop and think about this number for a second. 25%. By 1933, the unemployment rate had soared to an unbelievable 25%. That means 1 out of every 4 American workers was jobless, with absolutely no safety net there to catch them. The human cost was just devastating. Shantytowns built by the homeless and bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles after the president, they popped up in cities everywhere, and at the exact same time, a massive drought turned the Midwest into the Dust Bowl, forcing countless families to just abandon their farms and their homes. So in the face of this crisis, a crisis like nobody had ever seen before, the country looked to its leaders for answers. And 2 presidents, Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt, they offered 2 completely different visions for what the government should do. President Hoover, he believed deeply in something he called rugged individualism, basically the idea that people should help themselves and that the government should stay out of it. His successor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, argued for the exact opposite: direct, decisive government intervention. This letter here, it perfectly captures Hoover's philosophy. A 10-year-old girl actually wrote to him, offering to send blankets for the poor, and he told her to handle the charity locally. He really believed that help should come from communities and private groups, not from Washington, D.C. And then, in just stark contrast, you have this letter from FDR. He's out there actively asking for advice on how the federal government itself can step in and serve its people better. It's a total reversal in thinking. It's this belief that the problem was just too big for anyone but the government to solve. So, after being elected in a total landslide in 1932, Roosevelt did not waste a single second. He immediately got to work implementing his ambitious program of reforms, which he famously called the New Deal. The New Deal was really built on 3 core goals, which became known as the 3 Rs. First, you had immediate relief for the needy. Second, you had economic recovery to get businesses growing again. And third, you had systemic reform to make sure a crisis like this could never, ever happen again. And this led to what people called an alphabet soup of new government agencies, each with a very specific mission. You had the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put millions of young men to work on conservation projects. The FDIC, which insured people's bank deposits, finally restoring faith in the broken banking system. And, of course, Social Security, which created a permanent safety net for the elderly and unemployed, something that just didn't exist before. Now, look, the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression overnight, and it definitely faced some heavy criticism. Some people argued it made the government way too powerful, that it was a threat to free enterprise. But what it undeniably did was fundamentally and permanently change the relationship between the American people and their government. It set a whole new expectation for what Washington should do in a time of crisis. And that brings us to the core question that's really left in the wake of these 2 decades, a question that is just as relevant today as it was back then. The debate that defined the 1930s, right? That tension between Hoover's individualism and Roosevelt's interventionism, that's a conversation we're still having. How much should a government do for its people? Well, the answer continues to shape our world.